The one thing that I really didn't see too much of is the anticipation of sea level rise and the great devastation that it's going to be causing into the Guangdong province. So I'd open it up to any of you to discuss how you're going to interconnect a megacity, and yet it's going to start having all of these inlets opening up as the water starts rising 2 to 4 meters over the next 50, 70 years.
Well, I can probably take the most sort of adventuresome stab at it because I'm not practicing architect nor representing a practicing firm that would actually have to implement these ideas. But, I mean, essentially, the way that I concluded the presentation was to say that we need to think of tall buildings as infrastructure. And I would expand the definition from not just, extending a pipeline that supplies a building into the vertical and then again to the horizontal, or even having horizontal elevators, which it would include theoretically. But also, if you think of them, if you start to connect buildings horizontally and you replicate some of the experience of the ground plane at a higher level, then you leave more options for what you can do with the ground plane, including designing for the fact that there may not be much of a ground plane left. The other option, I guess, is to move cities, as far inland as you think you possibly can, in order to protect them. But probably the solution lies somewhere in between, which has to do with allowing nature to take its course in wetlands. And, by gathering ourselves into taller structures, which would obviously have to be strategically placed, because we know that these buildings require basements and all other kinds of ground level facilities in order to function, and those can flood. So they would still have to be placed on relatively high ground. But I think thinking almost like what are the things you throw on the ground? The jacks, like the game of jacks. If you think of tall buildings as being like part of the coastal infrastructure, the ring of protection, including vegetation, including some of the other innovations that we saw in the other two presentations, I think we're getting somewhere. Building right up to the edge with a hard edge, with a concrete spillway is not going to solve anything. It's going to make everything worse.
I really liked your slide where you had the kind of flat plane that kind of lifted up. I thought it was the best slide of today's presentation. But the main question around that is, I think you both touched on the importance of how to make this work is really a clear partnership between public and private entities. And that's a real challenge. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and maybe who do you think is the right to take the lead in that kind of partnership? Because someone has to take the lead.
It depends where you're working, what the relationship is between the private sector and the public sector. And in China, the public sector has a lot of strength. It's very much driven by government priorities, government action. In Southeast Asia, that's not the case, as you know, probably. It's mostly driven by the private sector, private development corporations, and the governments are actually fairly weak. So I think it has to be, it depends on where you're working, and somehow bringing these two parties together. I think in China it's much more possible because the government has so much more authority.
Yeah, I would essentially echo that position. I think there are a few examples, one of which hopefully some of you will get to tour. It's obviously on a much smaller scale than what we're talking about here, but it is kind of the beginnings of it. If you look at the Skybridge network in Hong Kong, what we're envisioning, is interconnected tall buildings at multiple levels. But we've already started to do that. In the quasi-public realm, you've got these walkways connecting a bunch of private developments who are seeing a lot of benefit from the increased foot traffic, people feeling they can safely cross the street, avoid the elements. There are reasons why it's more difficult to progress that upwards into the 50th floor, the 100th floor, but they're not impossible to overcome. I would not be surprised if Hong Kong was the first place where that actually begins to happen, because they already have the density of tall buildings in place. And as it, integrates further with China and its very sort of centralized top-down planning method, I definitely think we're probably sitting in the place where most of the integration is going to happen first. And I think then the rest of the world will look to it and say, why can't we do that? And start to ask those questions. I don't know how long that would take. Obviously, governments don't just decide to reform themselves, and private developers don't just decide that they want to start emphasizing the public realm rather than their own profit. But at some point, those priorities do and can converge. But I think the Skybridge network here and some of what's going on in Singapore, I think already contains the seedlings of what that future could look like between the cooperation between the public and private entities.
What do you think the upper limit is for the planet? And in a lot of cities, the population directly impacts how the city performs. So if you plan a city for 8 million people and now you have more people coming in, how easy it is to control the population of a city, and what ideas and initiatives in terms of policy you think are working better, or if you think that should be controlled, that should be whose decision it is, or if maybe it's something that cannot be controlled?
I can't speak to the policy, but I do think that as these cities continue to grow and the populations grow, that what's important is that we focus on the ability of the city to sustain a quality of life. And the way that we plan the cities and we design our buildings within there is respectful of that. And that's why the Pearl River District, to me, has some concepts that make a lot of sense. That you can continue to grow a city, but do it in not a centralized, exponentially growing element, but as one that has a series of nodes and they can connect together. And that way you can maintain a sense of density that is more of a scale that you can create a higher amount of density, but still connect it together and allow the population to expand. I don't know what the upper limit is, and I don't know that anybody, maybe you have I don't know what that would be. And we'll have to find out. But I do think as we continue to work on these projects, keeping in mind that we can't forget about the pedestrian life, the human scale, and the respect that we have for natural light and clean air.
We've been exploring elevating the whole city, like Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent. The government are not as strong as the private sector. And like the super typhoon in the Philippines, the tsunami was 8 meters high. And then the Indian Ocean tsunami, it was about the same height. Then governments declare a no-build zone, say 40 meters. But the private sector is stronger than the political will. So why don't we just elevate the city and interconnect them and let the floods come in? So instead of very expensive, unimplementable mitigation, why don't we just do adaptive architecture and engineering? Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to comment on that as well. And maybe I can hit your question as well too. I think you're exactly right. I think these sort of broad-reaching statements about raising cities or moving cities, I think it's just not reality from an implementation standpoint. And I think we are very clever as engineers and architects and builders and people specializing in construction that we can solve a lot of these problems on a project-by-project basis. Many of the projects we're seeing in Southeast Asia that are in coastal areas are requiring us to build up 2, 3, 4 meters above what is now considered ground. So I think the response to sea level rise will be incremental. There's no magic sort of broad sweeping gesture that we can implement that's going to take care of that problem. But I'm 100% confident we're all clever enough to overcome that in the future. I think you asked, I think, about upper limit of population. I think that's a really fascinating question. I don't think it's driven by our ability to build things or house people or create cities. I think it's driven more by the environment's ability to sustain a population in terms of food. You know, the Pearl River Delta used to provide a lot of the food for many of the cities around here, but because the Delta is essentially dying from an ecological standpoint, now the fishing fleets have to go much further afield. They have to go down to the Philippines, Indonesia, or out into the open ocean and bring food back for the people that live here. So I don't think the limit will be defined by our ability to house or build cities. It'll be defined by the Earth's capacity to sustain the population.
This is in regards to the growth of population throughout the Guangdong province and the fact that maps from 50 years ago showed small density and it kept growing and growing and growing, and we may get up to 150 million people here in the Pearl River Basin. 150 million. The problem is we are eliminating nature, we are eliminating biodiversity, and that's the safety guard, the net, that keeps us from being one solid humanity here. What do we do about pandemics? Because this river basin is ground zero for swine flu and avian flu. If we don't put some space in there to open up nature and protect us on it, we could lose 50 million people in one sweep. So, do you have any comments about that?
That's quite a dramatic future you've portrayed. I don't think the Pearl River Delta is any more of a ground zero for disease than any other megacity in the world. I'm not sure why you would focus on this place in particular. You go to Jakarta, go to KL, or go to Africa. So, you know, of course, as people live more and more closely together, there's always the sense or chance of types of incidents like that. So I agree with you. We need a stronger safety net from an environmental standpoint.
I mean, I think it's a question of interlacing. If you are going to be densifying an area and increasing the population, you have to interlace it with green space and breathing room for people, just from a fundamental quality of life perspective, let alone trying to stop a pandemic, which I'm not sure if that's in the wheelhouse of architects and engineers, unless they're acting under the good advices of global climate scientists and the like. But fundamentally, it's hard to argue against inserting more green space as you build.
My question for you is, I know that the central government of China has provided some sort of new directives in terms of breaking up those super blocks. My question for you guys is that apparently you guys have been practicing in China for quite a bit of time, and you have the experience and your knowledge. And what are your thoughts about this? And would breaking up super block work, or is super block? Is the West can learn something? Does the West actually learn something from the experience in China in terms of rethinking about the super blocks, or vice versa? I'm just a general question about the super blocks.
The idea of the super blocks, I think, has changed, at least for me, not only in China but around the world. The idea where you create a wall that creates a strong urban edge that extends indefinitely for block after block and allows no sense of permeability into the site is one that does not necessarily work to promote a street life and a strong urban context. So whether we're working in China or we're working in other areas of the world, the idea that you create a sense of permeability to the site is one that I think we all strive to do. And some of the images I showed where we had towers that came to the ground, even though that you could call that a super block because it does extend for multiple blocks, the ability to get into the site, whether it's through the towers or whether it's through canyons that are created for retail environments, is one that allows a permeability to the site that breaks down the scale of the super block. And not only that the block has permeability, but the buildings themselves have permeability. They're not walled up retail, interior focused spaces, but they have a relationship to the street. They have a scale that's appropriate for the street. They have a terracing they have moments where outdoor and indoor come together. And that, I think, is what Jane Jacobs is appropriately describing when she's saying you need small blocks. It's not that you have to have a small block, but you need the ability for scale to be appropriate for the human being, and that you need the ability to meander through and create those moments of joy in life.